Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I have some exciting news for you this week. I have just moved my newsletter from my author website over to Substack. So for any of you who are already subscribed at my website, keep an eye out for updates in your inbox. I'm really excited to join the dynamic community of writers and science communicators on Substack. This platform will offer me the opportunity to write more regularly and collaborate with other experts, enhancing the discourse on the science behind botanical medicines. My goal is to really build a community around a common interest in the healing power of nature. And my hope is that this will be a trusted place that scientists, physicians, pharmacists, herbalists, and basically anybody that's interested in natural remedies can turn to find the latest science-based information on botanicals and traditional systems of medicine. I'll also be able to use this platform to tease out exciting themes that we're addressing here on the Fabulous Foodie Pharmacology podcast as well. So to sign up, just head on over to naturespharmacy.substack.com. All right, let's dig into the show. I don't know about you, but I have had a really busy weekend of getting my vegetable seeds ready for my spring garden. I love spending time in my garden. There's nothing quite like it, this ability to plant something so tiny and then a few months later to have something large and delicious and nutritious just awaiting harvest. And you don't have to be a botanist to enjoy gardening, but just think for a moment how much more fun your time in the garden would be if you had a few more knowledge tools in your garden kit. This is where our guest for this week comes in. Dr. Scott Zona is our guest for the week. He's an American botanist, and he worked as the palm biologist at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden from 1993 to 2008, and then as curator for the Florida International University Conservatory until 2017. He's most noted for his work on palms and has done a lot of botanical research in the Western Pacific, in the Caribbean, Central America, South America, Madagascar, and the continental US. He's also published over 175 scientific and popular articles. But most importantly to the show, Dr. Zona is a gifted teacher and really talented writer. And I know this firsthand as he is the professor that first taught me how to identify tropical and subtropical plants in graduate school courses. He's the author of this fantastic new book. It's entitled A Gardener's Guide to Botany, The Biology Behind the Plants You Love, How They Grow, and What They Need. This was just published, and it's incredible. It's rich in these beautiful figures and illustrations and photographs, and is incredibly helpful in making some pretty complex ideas really simple to grasp and easy to apply in the garden. So it's really great to see you again today, Scott. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for that very kind introduction.
Great. Well, why don't we start with a simple question of what really motivated you to write this book?
Well, it all goes back to the year 2020, which was, for many of us, sort of a lost year with lockdown and all of that. And I was sitting here at home and unemployed, and a friend of mine said, well, you could still teach through Zoom and, and with all the technology now that, you could still teach, and you don't need to be attached to a university or anything. You could offer courses and advertise them on social media. So I thought that was a brilliant idea. And I offered a 4-session course online called The Botany of Houseplants, because, during lockdown, houseplants were huge.
They were
still
huge.
They were huge during lockdown. They were all over Instagram. And it went really well. And I had a lot of people sign up, and it went really well. Had a great time doing it. Talked to lots of great people. But it caught the attention of a publisher who said that they'd like to have a book about that, and would I be interested? And I said, sure. And we wrote the proposal, and she took the proposal to her higher ups, and they said, well, houseplants is a little too niche. Can you do something on, for gardeners in general? And I said, well, yeah, I can do that. So that's how it began. And so I early 2021, I started, got the proposal all finished and the contract signed, and Submitted the final manuscript on Valentine's Day 2022. And
That's
then it was
great.
published in December of last year.
That's fabulous. Well, I mean, I really like the way that you've structured the book. I mean, chapter 1 begins with this, just being a plant. What is it like to be a plant? How did you come up with the structure for this? I mean, I know you've been teaching graduate and undergraduate courses for years. Who's your audience for this book?
Well, it's actually not, I certainly wasn't writing a textbook or writing for other botanists. That was not the audience at all. Although I've actually heard from some of my botanical colleagues that they're using this as a textbook in some of their intro classes. But I wanted to talk to people that are interested in plants, but maybe didn't, have a botany degree or didn't have all the educational background. So that was my audience, was people that were interested in plants, and of course gardeners are by definition interested in plants. So, but I thought, I didn't want to write a book about how to grow plants. This is not a book about how to grow plants. This is a book about how plants grow, and because I'm not an expert horticulturalist by any stretch, so I just kind of buckle down on what I think I do best, and that's talking about plants and explaining the botanical end of things, and tried to use examples of familiar garden plants as examples, because I figured that would people could relate to that.
That's great. Well, I like the focus on the plant centric focus, and what does a plant need in terms of water. I've learned that some plants need a lot of water and some plants not at all. I have killed many a succulent in my office because I overlove them. what types of examples can you give us, just to give us a little sneak peek into how you're teaching people about what plants actually need?
Well, I did try to break it down in terms of what they need for light, what they need for water, nutrients, and what they need for air circulation, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And I actually, my undergraduate degree is in horticulture, so I've been growing plants myself for a long time. Have some plants behind me there, and so it was. I think I know what the challenges are of growing plants, especially in a house. Here now, I'm living in a more temperate climate. I can't just grow things outside like I did when I lived in Miami. So I know what the challenges are, and I've experienced them firsthand. So I thought that gave me the background I needed to communicate with people about plants.
That's great. And I think you also get into a little bit on plant secondary metabolism and kind of defense compounds. Can you share with us a bit more about that? Like, what are plant defense compounds?
Well, as you know, plants are chemical factories. They cannot run from their predators, so they've got to defend themselves. And I look at defense in kind of 3 layers: a perimeter defense, and that might be the spines or the prickles or the tough waxy outer layer of a leaf. Those are sort of the perimeter defenses, but those can be breached. And when they are, then there's the constitutive defenses. These are the defenses that are always present. So these are the phytochemicals that are always there in the leaf or in the plant tissue. And then I talked about the inducible defenses, which are those compounds that are turned on when the plant is under attack. And so probably the defenses that people will probably be most familiar with are the perimeter defenses, those structural defenses like spines, but also the constitutive defenses like resin or milky sap or essential oils in the leaves, like the leaves of mint or any of the other members of the mint family. So those are all, we think of things in the mint family, we think of those as flavorings or herbal things that we add to our food. But for the plant, those are defensive compounds. Those are compounds to keep
Mm.
insects from eating their leaves. So yeah, it was fun to take a dive into the phytochemistry, and I do have a little background. My postdoc was actually working on cyanogenic plants that produce cyanide in their tissues. So naturally, I had to work a little of that into the book.
That's great. I actually just gave a lecture this morning for my botanical medicine and health class. It was my poison lecture, which is always fun. And yeah, we talked a lot about cyanogenic glycosides and how plants use them for defenses. Tell us a little bit more, like what types of plants do we find these compounds in, and what do they actually do
Yeah.
to mammals? Yeah.
Well, cyanide is one of those kind of universal toxins. It's pretty toxic to just about every aerobic organism, including plants. So it, of course, immediately begs the question, well, how does a plant manufacture a chemical that is toxic to plants? And as you already said, they do it by joining it up with the sugar molecule, and that's the cyanogenic glycoside. And when it's in that form, when it's joined to the sugar, it's completely harmless. It can be stored in the plant, it can be moved around, completely harmless. But the plant also makes an enzyme called a glucosidase that it stores in other parts of the leaf or other parts of the cell. And when that cell is ruptured or broken or chewed on by a caterpillar or something like that, the enzyme and the cyanogenic glycoside come together. The enzyme cleaves off the sugar. There's a couple of extra steps in there, but it basically cleaves off the sugar and liberates the cyanide, and the caterpillar is going to get a mouthful of cyanide. So that's the mechanism. And some plants don't make the enzyme, but that enzyme is very common in the digestive enzymes of most insects and animals. So even if the plant doesn't make the glucosidase, the animal probably makes that enzyme and will release the cyanide with its own digestive enzymes. So it's a common defense in a lot of plants. It's in some ferns. Bracken fern is a good example. It's in some conifers. It's known in taxus, some species of the yew, taxus, the genus Taxus. And it's in just all kinds of flowering plants, monocots, non-monocots, very common in grasses. In fact,
I had
it's
no
actually,
idea it was so common.
it's
That's
very
incredible.
common in a lot of our cultivated food plants.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the cultivated grasses like sorghum are full of cyanide. Manihot esculenta, I'm
The
blanking.
yucca or cassava manioc,
Yucca,
yeah.
cassava, yeah. Cassava is,
Mhm.
a tremendously important food crop in much of the tropical world, and yet it's full of cyanide and has to be, of course, properly processed before it can be safely consumed. So yeah, a lot of common cultivated plants, a lot of common ornamental plants. Nandina domestica which is very common here in the southeast, loaded with cyanide. Elderberry, Sambucus, is loaded with cyanide.
Mm.
Passiflora, the passion vines, they have lots of cyanide in
Cyanide.
their leaves.
Also, do we find cyanide or cyanogenic glycosides also in fruits within the Rosaceae family? Excuse me. Right. So apple seeds, plum seeds, peach seeds,
That's
like
right.
all of those pits. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have firsthand experience getting a little bit of cyanide poisoning from apricot pits that were used to flavor almond flavored
Oh,
cookies, the little amaretti cookies that you buy from
yes.
Italy around Christmas
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was when I was working as a postdoc on cyanogenic plants, and it was around Christmas time. And I don't know about you, but I can't keep cookies around the house without binging on them. And I
Yeah.
binged, but to my regret, because I had a little too many cookies and got a massive stomach ache and thought, this is odd. what's in those cookies? And I looked and I said, apricot pits. I took it to the lab the next day, and sure enough, they're full of cyanide.
Wow.
Which,
That's the great thing about being a scientist. You can bring whatever cookies remain to the lab and figure out what happened.
exactly. And, fortunately, we have the ability to detoxify a little bit of cyanide. So, I'm here to tell the tale. But, if one were to eat too much, yeah, you could overpower your detoxifying mechanism and succumb to cyanide poisoning. So yeah, Rosaceae is common, and in fact, it's in some of the fruits too. Like a lot of the wild cherries, the prunus, like Prunus serotina, some here in the southeast at least. I can't say for other parts of the world, but there is a little bit of cyanide left even in the mature fruit. The green fruits are very cyanogenic, and then as the fruit ripens, the cyanogenic glycosides are withdrawn. But they tend not to withdraw every last one of them. So there is cyanide detectable in many of the fruits. The same
and
way.
That's an adaptive advantage, correct? I mean, because they're basically, if the plant's withdrawing the cyanide compounds, it's so that they can actually have an animal come and eat the fruit and disperse the seed.
Yeah. You can certainly understand why when the fruit is young and still the seed is still developing, the plant doesn't want somebody to come and eat the fruit at that point because the seed's not ready yet. So it protects that young fruit and then withdraws the toxin when the fruit is ripe. And of course, it adds the sugars and the color and makes it attractive to dispersers. And in fact, I learned, I've been working with cyanogenic plants with Nandina this was last year, and learned that cedar waxwings, which are common birds here in eastern North America, have the ability to eat the cyanogenic fruits on cherries, but they do not digest and do not release the cyanide. They're able to sequester that cyanogenic glycoside without cleaving the sugar molecule off and pooping out the cyanogenic glycoside.
Wow.
Which is kind of amazing. So
it is amazing.
they're completely able to feast on cherries. And you know how cedar waxwings, they binge, just like I binge on cookies, they binge on fruit. And obviously, if they didn't have that ability to detoxify the fruit, they would suffer the consequences. But lucky for them, they can deal with the cyanogenic compound that's found in cherry fruit.
That's great. I'm thinking right now of a moment this summer. You're going to laugh at this because this is so unlike me because I'm always super prepared. We went on an expedition trip up into the mountains when I was in Albania with the crew, and we just forgot to put the food in the car, basically. So we're off in the mountains and we are starving, and there's no restaurants, there's no nothing. The villages are half abandoned. We're going all the way to this very remote place where just a few elderly people live, and it's just been such a long day and we're so hungry. And so we see a bunch of plum trees, Prunus domestica, that are being grown and full of green fruits, which you can eat. They're kind of very sour, but something just to get in your stomach. And I definitely had way too many because I was so hungry. And now I'm wondering, was I actually getting a little bit of cyanide with that prunus? I don't know. And the green fruit, maybe it's yeah, I wasn't anywhere near the lab to bring it back, but I definitely had a stomach ache at the end of the day. So.
Yeah, well, green plums, that'll do it.
Yeah. Funny. Well, because you're such an expert on houseplants as well, Scott, I wanted to kind of shift focus a little bit to those. And I'll kind of frame it this way. Today in class, we were talking about poisons, and we talked about the dangers of some houseplants, and specifically with reference to kind of oxalate-bearing plants. And what can you share with us about that? Are there certain houseplants that we should look out for, especially if we have pets or young children in the household? What are some of the things we should look out for?
Yeah, there are certain plant families, as you'll remember from tropical plant taxonomy, that are famous for having calcium oxalate in their tissues, and it's in the form of bundles of needle-shaped crystals.
Mm-hmm.
that are kind of encapsulated in uh, a gelatinous-like capsule, but they're very easy to see under the microscope. You've seen them, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the families that are famous for that are A, palms, and B, the aroid family. Both of those families are well known for having these crystals of calcium oxalate that are called raphides. And raphides are again, they're a defensive compound. They're a constitutive defense. They're always present, always ready to defend the plant against something that wants to eat it. So do they pose a risk just handling the plant? No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
It would have to become with consuming the plant, and I would imagine one would have to consume quite a bit to really suffer the consequences. There are some plants that are famous for having a really high concentration. The aroid genus Dieffenbachia
Mm-hmm.
is a common house plant. It's kind of
Known as
not as common as
Dumskin,
it
right?
used to be. It
Yeah,
used to
yeah.
be more fashionable. It's sort of fallen out of favor, but um, its tissues are loaded with this stuff, and the mode of toxicity with these raphides is, for a while, it was thought to be just the physical nature of these needle-like crystals that would, lodge in tender epithelial tissues there in your mouth or throat. But it's more than that. There's a toxin involved as well. So the crystals, these raphides crystals, will puncture the cells, the epithelial cells, and that allows then the toxin to enter the cell. And the exact nature of the toxin, I don't think is really well understood. And it may also be that some people, it may be more of like an allergen than it is a toxin. So some people are going to be more allergic than others. I remember collecting the fruit from a palm in this was in Indonesian New Guinea, the western half of the island of New Guinea. And this is a palm that is well known for having the calcium oxalate crystals in its fruit. And people always warn, do not handle the fruit, wear gloves, be careful. And I've handled the fruit before, never had a problem with these are juicy berry-like fruits, and you get the juice on you whenever you touch it.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never had a problem. So I thought, well, maybe it's time to do a little experiment. So I took some fruit, rolled up the sleeve, and got the nice tender underside of my wrist there, and rubbed some fruit right on there, and had absolutely no reaction. I monitored it for 24 hours, no reaction at all. So I
Huh.
think there is probably a allergic component there, and I'm just not allergic to it. That's my very unscientific
So
hypothesis.
I like it. Your clinical trial of N of one. That's good.
Yeah, N of one.
Yeah, that's great. Well, speaking of palms, I would be remiss if I didn't pick your brain a little bit on palms, because you are an expert on this family. What can you tell us about the relevance of palms to our food systems? I mean, this is a show all about food and health, and I know there are many edible palms, but maybe some of our listeners aren't familiar with those.
Yeah, well, the edible palm that everyone is probably aware of is African oil palm, which
Mm-hmm.
is a hugely important crop plant in the tropics. It's incredibly productive. It's more productive in terms of, uh, tons of oil per hectare than any other oil crop. So it's understandable why people grow it, because it's just incredibly productive, and it's a perennial. It's a palm. It's a perennial. It's not like soybeans that have to be planted every year.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, However, the demand for palm oil is huge, and unfortunately, a lot of clear, good, nice, healthy forest is being cut down for these monocultures of oil palm, and that's where the problem lies. Palm oil itself is not to blame. I mean, palm oil is not bad. Palms are not bad. It's simply uh, the converting healthy, biodiverse tropical forests
Mm,
into these monocultures of oil palm. That's where the problem lies. So
yeah.
there are some programs for sustainable palm oil, the palm oil that's produced on land that has already been degraded from other crops, other uses. So there are alternatives to chopping down intact forest, and so I think we need to encourage those alternatives. Nobody banning palm oil is not going to make it go away. It's probably in lots of things in our house. It's used not only as a food, but it's also used as sort of the chemical feedstuff for lots of other chemistry that goes
Mm,
on. So things like soaps and detergents and cosmetics and all sorts of things that are made from products that were originally palm oil but have been converted through chemistry into other things. So it's in so much, and it would be impossible to just make it go away. But we certainly need to do a better job at growing it more sustainably.
yeah. This
Um,
this this question of monoculture, I think, is really important because, you know, as you said, there's so many problems with large scale industrial monoculture, from, erosion of biodiversity to really susceptibility to disease. I hadn't been home in Florida for a couple of years because of, a combination of the pandemic and then the last hurricane. It was really hard, to get into town because of some of the damage to my hometown. But I was back just, I guess, a week or so ago, and it was tragic what I saw. I mean, here we had a huge monoculture, in this case of citrus trees. And citrus, as you know, are from Asia. And because of citrus greening, that's been a problem that's just kind of built and built and built until the groves have collapsed. They're being abandoned and divided up, for commercial and residential development. And it's incredibly sad because, this is a big part of Florida's economy, but also these, they've already displaced a lot of the natural habitats of oak hammocks and pine forests that, were the heart of Central Florida. um, I don't know if you want to comment on that or other crops that face similar challenges right now.
yeah, I feel your pain because I've been there too, and I've seen that's the Central Florida, which um, was converted into citrus culture pretty early on in the
Hmm.
development of Florida back in the early 20th century. And, citrus was this incredible driver of the economy for Florida for so long. And yeah, the last time I did the trip down the center of the state, particularly the area north of Orlando, between Gainesville and
Mm,
Orlando, yeah, I was shocked at the absence of citrus, and either groves that have been just abandoned, people have just walked away from them, and you can see all the weeds and the
yeah,
secondary growth coming up, or groves being converted into pine plantations and things like that. Other sources of income for the people that live there. Um, but yeah, it's sad because it's also sad that the habitat that citrus displaced is not
exactly. It's
coming back
gone.
into those
Yeah.
areas. I'm thinking specifically the sandpine scrub, which is an oak
Hmm.
dominated scrub
Hmm.
habitat in the deep sand areas of Central Florida on the ridge there, and that's not coming back, and that's a critically endangered habitat.
Yeah, it
Mm.
is, and it's incredibly beautiful habitat, that hosts a variety of plants and animals. And yeah, so it's interesting to see how agricultural trends influence, not just economies, but also ecosystems and livelihoods, and it's all intertwined. Yeah. Well,
Yeah. trying to imagine Florida without citrus. Having grown up
It's
there, I just
how do
can't.
you do it? Yeah,
I
it's
can't
like,
imagine Florida without
mhm.
orange juice served at the welcome stations there on the interstate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's about to be, I think, a thing of the past because it's
Yeah.
just, yeah. Well, let's move to a more positive note because I don't want to leave our listeners on a such a sad topic. And why don't we think about positive change? So, in your book, you talk a lot about, what plants need to really thrive. And as we're approaching the spring season, I know that folks are starting to get their seedlings ready, or they may be starting things indoors now. Um, do you have any advice in how, for example, in a suburban or urban environment, how people might be able to help foster biodiversity in their own neighborhoods? Like, or how do we contribute to diversity in our communities?
Yeah, well, there are so many great programs out there, most often run by local extension services
Hmm.
for uh, helping people uh, produce gardens that are beneficial to wildlife, to birds, to pollinators, to um, all the wildlife at every scale. And I think people could certainly get and take advantage of those programs. They vary from state to state, uh, but here in the United States, the local extension service, each county has its own extension service, and that would be a great place to start, to
Hmm.
ask if you're interested in making your garden and your immediate surroundings a little more biodiverse, a little more eco-friendly. Um, the other advice I can give is just stop using pesticides. Um, I was just in Home Depot this morning, um, and I'll go there again because every project requires 2 trips to Home Depot, apparently. Uh,
Yeah.
but I walked through the garden section, and it's just sad to see pallets and stacks of some pretty serious poisons there. And homeowners, these are all for homeowners. These are not for professional application. These are for homeowners to use. And um, if you really want birds to thrive in your garden and other wildlife, the best way to do it is just stop using the poisons, the pesticides, especially things like the neonicotinoids, things that
Hmm.
that stay in the environment and can persist and can poison non-target organisms. They'll kill
Hmm.
your pest, but they'll also kill everything else.
Yeah.
So that would be my advice. Talk to your extension people about programs for building biodiversity that are appropriate for whatever area you're in, and then kick the pesticide habit. Um, you know, Everybody wants a beautiful, pristine picture postcard garden. My garden certainly is not that. I think if we learn to tolerate a little bit of herbivory, a few weeds, it's not the end of the world. If your roses have a little bit of black spot on them, we just learn to live with it. It just means
Yeah.
that you've got an ecosystem that's a little healthier than those where everything is just
It's just so
picture
perfect and
perfect.
curated. I've
Yeah.
never understood why people spray like Roundup on their lawns or like try and kill the dandelions. I love to eat dandelion. Like, why would you kill it? It's a great soup ingredient.
It's a great early nectar source for bumblebees and other early emerging pollinators. So
Yeah.
yeah, I like them. I like dandelions. I don't bother trying to get them out because, well, first of all, how tough they are to pull out, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
I just don't have time to even try to even deal with the dandelions.
That's
So
great. Well, I have one last question for you, Scott, as we kind of get close to the end of the show. And this is one I ask of all of our guests is, do you have a favorite recipe that you'd like to share with us or some way that you like to take a vegetable from your garden? Like, what's one of your favorite recipes that you can share?
Oh, Cassandra, you hit me with this question out of the blue like this. You should have warned me.
I'm
Um,
sorry. It
yeah.
can be
Oh
simple. It
gosh.
can be sliced. It can be sliced fresh tomatoes. I mean, anything,
Yeah.
anything from
Yeah.
the
Well,
garden.
let me
Yeah.
tell you, what will soon be my favorite recipe, and it will be fresh asparagus that I pick from my garden.
Oh,
Part of the
nice.
reason that I left Miami and ended up here in North Carolina um, is that I had read Barbara Kingsolver's book, Animal Vegetable Miracle, and
Mm-hmm.
she just waxed, you know, poetic and rhapsodic about fresh asparagus. And of course, living in Miami at the time, you know, all
Mm-hmm.
our asparagus came from Peru or Mexico or, you know,
Yeah.
thousands of miles away. And my partner and I looked at the map and said, well, how far do we have to move where we can grow asparagus? And so, you know, unfortunately, I had to be out of Florida, but so yeah, so one of the first things um, when we got into that, and I've been here now about almost 3 years. So I planted my asparagus bed, and of course, all the books said you can't harvest the asparagus until about the third year, and
Mhm.
then thereafter. So this spring,
Oh,
they're still dormant right now, but this spring, in the next couple of months, I expect to see some asparagus shoots, and then my favorite recipe will probably be just um, fresh asparagus stuck under the broiler for a few minutes until they turn nice
mm,
and you know, golden around the edges, with butter and maybe a little garlic and maybe a squeeze of lemon. That'll be my favorite
wow.
recipe.
That sounds amazing, especially with them
Yeah.
being so fresh and from your garden. That's exciting. So it's like your 3-year asparagus anniversary coming up.
I'm excited.
That's
I'm
great.
you know, hoping that I'm going to get a
They'll
decent crop.
show.
I tell you, fighting the deers around here has been
Uh-huh.
traumatic. I plant something and, you know, 2 weeks later I look at it and it's just gone, and it
Oh
breaks my
no.
heart sometimes.
Get
But
some fits soon.
I have hopes. My other thing that's coming that I think will be flowering, and I'll probably get some fruit on this year, or this spring, this summer, will be pawpaws. I
Yes.
planted some grafted varieties, some cultivars,
Mhm.
named cultivars of pawpaws, and so fingers crossed, I'm going to get some pawpaws this summer.
That's amazing. I have 2 pawpaws in my yard as well, and so I had one little fruit last year. It got, I think, it got, fruit napped by some kind of maybe a deer, or maybe a squirrel or something took it
Yeah,
away.
between, you know,
But
the possums and the raccoons and the
yeah,
squirrels,
yeah, yeah.
I'm yeah.
But I'm hopeful
This
for this year.
the squirrels, we had a nice crop of green apples, and then one day, literally in one day, uh, about 4 or 5 gray squirrels went out there and just stripped the entire tree of all the green apples.
Wow.
And I think they take like one bite and decide they don't like it and throw it down and then go to the next one, you know. So it just ruined the crop. So, you know, as much as I love the idea of you know, being off the food grid, growing my own food,
It's
um,
really
I
hard.
know how hard it is, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
respect to all those people that can produce their own food and produce food for the rest of us, because it's
yeah.
hard. It's hard work.
It is, it is. Well, at least we can start with small steps with our home gardens, with our house plants,
And our
and yeah,
asparagus.
and your asparagus. And just a reminder, foodies, make sure you get this book, A Gardener's Guide to Botany. The biology behind the plants you love, how they grow, and what they need.
Cassandra, can I
Great.
add one more
Yeah,
thing?
sure.
Um, you know, I wrote this book for gardeners, and like I say, use
Hmm.
mostly garden examples. But what I really hope will happen is people will start to see beyond their garden, and they'll start to look at, you know, when they're driving down the road, and like around here, there's, you know, a lot of forest, and you think, for some people, they just see that as green wallpaper, you know.
Yeah,
And I'm hoping it'll open people's eyes to not only what's going on in their garden, but beyond the borders of the garden, in nature, in parks and other areas around them, not just their backyard garden, but everywhere, that these plants are important.
oh, that's amazing. Yes, we want more people to be able to notice nature and start driving like a botanist does, which, you know how botanists drive. We drive
Yeah.
and we see something off the side of the road, we pull over.
Eyes on the road, Cassandra.
I know, eyes on the road. This is a good thing, like when my husband drives, so I can just like keep walking. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Scott, for coming on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. That's our show for today. If you've enjoyed this episode and others, please head over to Apple Podcasts and hit those 5 stars in the rating section. We're always looking for financial support to keep the show going, and it can be as simple as just buying me a cup of coffee. Head on over to buymeacoffee.com/foodiepharma and purchase a cup of Joe to support the show. If you're interested in merchandise, we also have a really fun assortment of foodie pharmacology mugs, shopping bags, notebooks, t-shirts, and more. Head over to mysterycontrol.com and search up foodie pharmacology. I want to thank our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth from Co-Conspiracy Entertainment, and thanks to you, my dear listeners, for tuning in every week. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.